On July 2nd, 2026, Chanel, one of luxury fashion's last great independent conglomerates, announced it had acquired full ownership of Charvet, the Paris shirtmaker, founded on Place Vendôme in 1838. The deal included the six-floor building on the square and the production workshop in the central French town of Saint-Gaultier. Financial terms were not disclosed. What the announcement did not say, and what the press coverage largely did not pursue, was why the sale happened at all. Charvet was not financially distressed. The house was not losing clients. The answer came out gradually over the following days, through comments from Chanel's fashion president, Bruno Pavlovsky, and reporting by Menswear Daily. And it had nothing to do with the narrative that usually accompanies a luxury acquisition. The Colbin family had owned Charvet since 1965, when a fabric supplier named Denis Colbin bought the company from the founding family's heirs. Denis passed the business to his children, Jean-Claude and Anne-Marie. Jean-Claude and Anne-Marie had reached the point where the question of what came next could no longer be deferred. The next generation, their own children, had built careers in other industries entirely. There was no one on the inside with both the desire and the capability to take the house forward. Pavlovsky said to Menswear Daily, "They don't have any internal or family successors, and we had a super good feeling, so we decided that the future of Charvet will be with Chanel." The world's oldest dedicated shirt maker, a house that had dressed Charles de Gaulle and Winston Churchill, that carried no advertising budget and no celebrity campaigns, and no sign above the door that announced what it was, did not end 188 years of independent ownership because the market moved on, or because a conglomerate made an offer that couldn't be refused. It ended because a family ran out of someone willing to carry it forward. That is a different story than the one most often told about what's happening to the institutions of old money menswear. The version that circulates tends to go like this. Luxury conglomerates, LVMH, Kering, Richemont, accumulate power. Heritage houses resist as long as they can, and money eventually wins. There are plenty of cases that fit that frame, and it is not wrong. But it is incomplete. A growing number of the houses that built the old money wardrobe are not ending because they were acquired against their will. They are ending or changing past recognition because the specific human knowledge required to produce what they produce is retiring faster than it is being replaced. And because the families who built these institutions did not produce successors who wanted to continue them. The contrast worth holding in mind here is Hermès. The Hermès family, the Dumas branch of the founding Hermès line, has controlled the house across 6 generations and continues to hold the majority of its capital. When Bernard Arnault of LVMH began accumulating a stake in Hermès between 2010 and 2012, the family responded by creating a holding company that locked in family control and made a hostile takeover structurally impractical. The episode cost LVMH a regulatory fine and ended with Arnault selling the stake at a significant profit. Hermès is not evidence that independence is always possible. It is evidence that succession planning and family alignment made independence defensible in a way it was not at Charvet and would not be at Armani. Charvet's annual revenue is estimated at around 10 million euros, a figure that appeared in reporting by Man of Many. It places the world's most storied shirt maker roughly in the range of a well-run regional business. The shirts themselves cost around 655 euros. The craft that produces them involves hand techniques that do not exist in manuals or pattern sheets. Techniques that live in the physical memory of cutters who learned from the people before them, Those techniques are now inside Chanel, which has historically avoided building a dedicated, standalone menswear line. What the acquisition does to them over the next decade is not yet known. The immediate trigger for the sale was 3 shirts. In October of 2025, Mathieu Blasi used 3 oversized cotton button-up shirts made by Charvet in his debut Chanel collection, weighted at the hem with a signature chain. A co-branded tuxedo shirt that followed retailed at $7,130 and sold out in boutiques within hours of reaching shelves. 9 months after those shirts appeared on a runway, 188 years of Charvet's independence had ended. Blasi told Pavlovsky he had formed an instant rapport with the Colbans. That rapport gave the Colban family their exit and removed their last reason to look elsewhere. The Savile Row situation developed more slowly, and the arithmetic underneath it is harder to reverse. A decade ago, a survey of the tailors working on the row found the average age around 60, and the trade was not producing apprentices at anything close to the rate at which established cutters were approaching retirement. The knowledge required to make a bespoke suit on Savile Row's terms cannot be separated from the person who holds it. It lives in how a cutter reads a cloth's behavior on a particular body, in the pressure applied to a lapel roll, in the thousands of small corrections accumulated across years of fitting sessions. It cannot be documented in a way that fully transfers. It is learned by doing it under someone who already knows it for years, until the knowledge stops being instruction and becomes instinct. A Savile Row bespoke jacket is cut to the specific client, not to a standard pattern. This is worth distinguishing precisely from made-to-measure tailoring, which adjusts a pre-existing block pattern to recorded measurements. Bespoke cutting begins from scratch. The cutter observes how the client stands, how he carries weight across his shoulders, how his posture deviates from what the cloth will naturally want to do without correction. What houses like Henry Poole, Huntsman, and Anderson and Shepherd produce is built on canvas construction, an internal floating canvas that molds to the body over years of wear, rather than the fused interlinings used in most commercial tailoring. The adjustments made from observation are not transcribed during the fitting. They are held by the cutter and applied the next time cloth is on the board. What practitioners call the rock of eye, the ability to read a body and a cloth simultaneously and cut without mechanical measurement, is the skill that takes a decade to develop and cannot be taught from a manual. Transferred through years of observation and correction, this knowledge produces work that is structurally different from made-to-measure tailoring, regardless of price point. It also means that when the cutter retires, the knowledge retires with them unless they have spent years actively handing it on to someone who stayed long enough to receive it. Some houses responded to the identified shortage with formal apprenticeship programs, and those programs have produced skilled young cutters. The story is not uniformly grim, but the economics of bespoke training work against the trade in ways that good intentions alone cannot resolve. A bespoke tailor requires something in the range of 7 to 10 years of structured learning under a master cutter before the work meets the standards these houses sell against. During those years, the apprentice produces little of commercial value to the house. The master cutter's time, the scarcest thing a small bespoke house possesses, is partially absorbed by teaching rather than cutting. For a house where the master cutter is also the person whose name and judgment the house is built on. Sustaining this over successive generations is not a sentimental challenge. It is an economic one. There are roughly a dozen houses doing genuine bespoke work on Savile Row at any given time. The public tends to think of Savile Row as a brand. It is not a brand. It is a collection of individual houses, each of which is at its core the accumulated judgment of a small number of people. When those people retire without adequate succession, the house continues under the same name while producing something materially different from what it produced before. The sign above the door does not change. The work beneath it does. And it changes quietly enough that most clients never notice until they try to go back to what they remember. For most of his career, Giorgio Armani's refusal to sell a controlling stake in his company was treated as the conviction of a particular kind of founding generation founder. Bernard Arnault of LVMH made direct approaches over the decades, most persistently in the late 1990s and again in the 2000s, and each was declined. Armani told interviewers on multiple occasions that independence was not a negotiating position, but a condition. His company reached revenues of around 2.3 billion euros in 2024, and a valuation estimated above 5 billion, entirely without conglomerate infrastructure, which made the refusals increasingly difficult for the industry to dismiss as simple stubbornness. Armani died on the 4th of September, 2025. He was 91 years old. His will, which became public in the following weeks, instructed his heirs to sell 15% of Giorgio Armani S.p.A. within 18 months of the will's reading, with priority given to LVMH, EssilorLuxottica, and L'Oréal in that order. A second tranche of between 30 and 54.9% was to follow between the third and fifth year after his death. The Armani Foundation was required to retain at least 30% of the company's capital and retains governance influence over key decisions. 18 months from September of 2025 lands around March of 2027. Armani did not write that will under duress. He wrote it knowing what his company was and what managing it at that scale required once he was no longer there. There was no internal successor capable of taking on revenues of 2.3 billion euros without structural support he had not otherwise arranged. The foundation preserved his principles. It did not preserve independence in the conventional sense, because full independence from institutional capital at that scale was not viable once the founder was gone. And he had known this for some time. The will codified the principles that must govern the company after his death, requiring that it be managed with, in the document's language, moral integrity and fairness, and that it pursue an essential, modern, elegant, and unostentatious style. That language is Armani's own design vocabulary turned into a legal obligation on whoever eventually holds a majority stake. Whether a clause in a document can substitute for 50 years of a founder's daily judgment about color, silhouette, and restraint is a question that will begin to be answered around 2027, when a new majority shareholder starts making decisions that were previously made by one person alone, from a studio in Milan. The pattern across these three cases is real, but the mechanism is different in each. Charvet was a family business with no family member who wanted to continue it. The Savile Row trade is losing the specific embodied knowledge that defines its product, one retirement at a time. Armani ran his company for 50 years without identifying a successor who could manage it at scale, then left a legally binding schedule for what would happen once he was gone. In all three, the institution continues or will continue. What changes, and what nobody in the immediate conversation tends to dwell on, is what the institution actually produces once the conditions that defined it are no longer present. There is a reasonable argument that this is simply how things work. Institutions change hands, crafts evolve. What survives is what the market supports. That argument is not wrong. But if you are buying a shirt on Place Vendôme, or commissioning a suit on Savile Row, or reaching for an Armani jacket sometime in the late 2020s, it is worth asking exactly what you are buying, and where the thing that made it what it cost went. Charvet will remain at Place Vendôme. The building is part of what Chanel bought, and the Colburns have agreed to stay involved during the transition. The shirts will still be made there. Whether they will be what they were is a question that won't have a clear answer for several years, and by the time it does, most customers won't have anything recent to compare them against.